There are letters in the archives that Katherine Mansfield never sent. Not the letters she wrote and revised and sent through the post to her husband in London. Not the letters she dictated when her hands were too weak to hold the pen. Not the formal literary correspondence that the biographers have catalogued and the scholars have debated. The letters she never sent are the ones that exist in a different form, in the specific quality of the prose in which she described a garden gate in Wellington, a bay on a New Zealand summer morning, a family gathered around a table in a house that the reader of the story has never visited, but that the story makes feel as familiar as their own childhood. Those are the letters she was writing to the place she had left. The stories are the correspondence she maintained with a country she called, at various points in her adult life, an awful little colonial suburb, a place that suffocated her, a world too small for what she needed to become, and also the place whose specific light and whose specific air and whose specific quality of afternoon she described with a precision that nobody who had not been formed by it could have managed, and that nobody who was still living in it could have seen clearly enough to put into words. Katherine Mansfield was born Kathleen Mansfield Beauchamp on the 14th of October 1888 in Wellington, New Zealand, the harbour city on the southern tip of the North Island, a city of hills and wind, and the particular quality of the Pacific light on the water of the bay that she would describe, 15 years after leaving it, and 2 years before dying of the disease that was consuming her lungs, in one of the most celebrated pieces of short prose in the English language, At the Bay. She wrote it in France. She had not seen the bay in 15 years. She rendered it with the accuracy of someone who had been paying attention every moment they were there, storing the detail against the use they would eventually make of it. Her father was Harold Beauchamp, a successful Wellington businessman who would eventually be knighted for his services to commerce and to the colony. Her mother, Annie Burnell Dyer, was a woman of some delicacy of constitution, who found the demands of motherhood and colonial social life more consuming than restorative.
The family was comfortable in the way that successful colonial families were comfortable. Not wealthy in the European aristocratic sense, but well-placed and well-regarded, occupying the social position that money and respectability together produce in a society that is still in the process of deciding what its hierarchy looks like. There were 3 sisters before Katherine, Vera, Charlotte, and Jean, and a brother, Leslie, who was younger, and who would die in France in 1915, and whose death would break something in Katherine that the tuberculosis would eventually finish. The family lived in various Wellington houses as Harold Beauchamp's prosperity allowed them to move upward through the social geography of the city, eventually settling in a substantial house in Karori, the house that would become, in Katherine Mansfield's fiction, the Burnell family home of the Prelude stories, the house with the garden and the gate and the specific domestic world that she would return to again and again in her writing, as a place that was simultaneously the source of everything and the thing that she had to escape. She went to school in Wellington, and she was clever, and she noticed things, and she wrote stories, poems, diary entries, with the absorbed seriousness of a child for whom writing was not a pastime, but a necessity, the medium through which the surplus of perception that the world was providing became something manageable. She was also, from early, aware that Wellington was not the place where the kind of writing she wanted to do was possible, or at least not the place where the kind of writer she wanted to become could form herself. The colony was too small. The literary culture was too thin. The social expectations were too specific and too constraining. She needed somewhere else. The somewhere else was London, and the route to London was Queen's College, where she was sent at 14 to study with her 2 sisters. She arrived in London in 1903 and spent the next 3 years in a city that was everything Wellington was not, the center of the English literary world, the place where the writers she had been reading from the distance of the colony were living and working, the city in which the modernist revolution in English literature was beginning to take shape in the conversations of people in rooms she was close enough to glimpse.
She returned to Wellington in 1906 because Harold Beauchamp had decided that 3 years in London was education enough, and that his daughter should come home and find her proper place in Wellington society. She returned, and she spent 2 years in Wellington, and she was miserable, in the specific way that someone who has seen the larger world is miserable when confined to the smaller one. She wrote, she played cello, she socialized, she formed relationships that Wellington was not designed to accommodate, and she argued with her father until he agreed to provide her with a modest allowance that would allow her to return to London.
She was 19 years old when she left Wellington for the last time, in July 1908. She did not know it was the last time. She thought she was going back to England to become a writer and to live the life that London made possible. She did not know that the life and the disease and the specific consuming urgency of what she had to do would prevent the return that she thought, at various points, she wanted to make. She left. She never came back. And the place she left became, in the 15 years between her departure and her death, the most persistent subject of the most important work she produced. The correspondence she sent home in those 15 years is one of the most extensive and revealing bodies of personal writing that any New Zealand-born person has produced. She wrote to her father, to her mother, to her sisters, to her banker father about money, always about money, because the allowance was never quite adequate to the life in London and then in France, and the appeals for additional funds were a recurring and slightly humiliating element of the correspondence. She wrote to friends and to literary acquaintances and to the editors and publishers who were the gatekeepers of the world she was trying to enter. The letters are the evidence of the life as it was actually lived, the life behind the fiction, the daily reality of lodgings and illness and financial anxiety, and the specific struggles of a woman trying to establish herself in a literary world that did not always know what to make of her colonial origins, her colonial accent, the colonial quality of her perceptions that was, paradoxically, the source of the distinctiveness that would eventually distinguish her from the English writers with whom she was competing and alongside whom she was working. She was not English.
She never became English, despite the 15 years of living in England and France and the European literary circles she inhabited. She was a colonial, and she knew it, and the knowing was both a burden and a resource. A burden because the colonial was always slightly outside the culture she was trying to enter, always speaking a version of English that carried the traces of where it had come from, always describing a world that the English literary establishment found slightly exotic and therefore interesting in ways that were not always flattering. A resource because the outside position, the position of the person who sees the familiar from a slight angle, who cannot take the obvious for granted because the obvious is not quite obvious to them, is one of the most productive positions available to a writer. She used it completely. The New Zealand stories, the stories set in Wellington and its surrounds, in the houses and the gardens and the bays that she had left at 19, are the evidence of what the outside position produced in her specific case. They are written with the clarity of someone who can see what they are describing, precisely because they are describing it from a distance, and with the warmth of someone who is describing something they can no longer have. The distance and the warmth together are what make the stories work. The Garden Party is not a story that a person living in Wellington in 1921 could have written, because the person living in Wellington would not have been able to see the Garden Party with the combination of intimacy and detachment that Mansfield brings to it. The intimacy comes from having been formed in that world. The detachment comes from having left it and not being able to return. The distance is the condition of the clarity. She knew this, or some version of it. She wrote in her journals about the specific obligation she felt to write about the New Zealand world, an obligation that became most intense and most explicit after her brother Leslie was killed on the Western Front in October 1915. Leslie Beauchamp had come to Europe in 1915 to serve in the war, and he and Katherine had spent time together in London before he was sent to the front, and they had talked about the Wellington childhood, about the specific places and people and moments that had formed them both, and there had been between them the particular quality of intimacy that siblings who were also genuine literary companions can produce, a conversation about the meaning of where they had come from that neither of them could have had with anyone who had not been there. And then Leslie was killed, and Katherine was in France, and she made an entry in her journal that described what she had lost and what she owed it. She wrote that she wanted to make her writing a tribute to Leslie, to write about the New Zealand world they had shared as a memorial to him, to make it live in the fiction with the same immediacy and specificity that it had lived in their conversations. She wrote that this was her duty and her love and her most pressing obligation as a writer. The story she produced in the years that followed, in the years of the tuberculosis's progressive claim on her body, in the years of the European journeys in search of climate and treatment, and the elusive possibility of a few months of health in which to do the work,
are the answer to that obligation. Prelude, the long story that Virginia Woolf's Hogarth Press published in 1918. At the Bay, the companion piece that extends the Prelude world through a long summer morning. The Garden Party, which appeared in the collection of 1922. These are the stories that New Zealand, in the decades since her death, has claimed as the defining works of its national literature. She wrote them in France and in Switzerland and in the Italian Riviera and in the various rented rooms and borrowed houses that the tuberculosis and the financial anxiety and the restless search for health made her home. She wrote them from memory, using the specific detail of a world she had last inhabited as a child and a teenager, using the letters she had sent home and the letters she had received from home, and the journals she had kept throughout the years of the exile as the archive from which the prose was assembled. She did not write home in any direct sense.
The letters she sent were letters that described the life she was actually living. The financial anxiety, the health, the literary work, the relationships. The stories are the letters she was writing to the place itself, to the specific quality of the world she had left, to the obligation she had made to Leslie, and to the childhood that the two of them had shared, and that the war had taken one of them from. The letters to the country she had left are in the stories. They are the most eloquent correspondence she ever produced. And they were never sent, because there was nowhere to send them that was as real as the place they were addressed to. She died on the 9th of January 1923 at the Gurdjieff Institute at Fontainebleau, southeast of Paris. She was 34 years old. The tuberculosis had been progressing for more than 5 years, and the conventional medical treatments had not halted it. And in the final months, she had placed herself under the care of G.I. Gurdjieff, the Greek-Armenian spiritual teacher whose institute at Fontainebleau was a community of people seeking, through physical work and spiritual discipline and Gurdjieff's own eclectic and demanding teaching, something that the ordinary world was not providing. She had gone there because the ordinary world's medicine was not saving her, and because the urgency of the time remaining was not something she was prepared to spend in a sanatorium waiting for the end. She died climbing the stairs to her room after watching a music and dance performance by the Institute's students. She had been laughing. Ida Baker, who was with her, described her laughing and talking rapidly about how happy she was. And then she was coughing. And then the hemorrhage came. And then it was over. New Zealand learned she was dead from the newspapers. The country that she had called a place she could not breathe sent its condolences to the family and began almost immediately the process of claiming the dead writer as its own. The face that had found the colony too small to contain it was, in death, the face that the colony put on its currency. The stories that she had written from the distance of exile became the stories the colony taught to its children as the truest account of what New Zealand was. The letters she never sent found their destination at last. The destination was the country that had produced her, and that she had fled.
The destination received them in the condition that the destination most prefers, without the inconvenience of the living person, without the contradiction of someone who is both the source of the national pride and the evidence of the national failure, without the embarrassing fact that the country had been unable to hold what it now wanted to claim. She is on the $50 note. She is in the museum, in the house in Wellington where she was born. She is in the scholarships and the prizes and the arts programs that carry her name. She is everywhere in the national cultural life of the country she left at 19 and never returned to. She is also in the stories. She is in the garden party and the bay and the gate and the specific light of a Wellington afternoon that she described from France with the clarity of someone who understood that the only way to see a place truly is to leave it and not be able to go back. The letters she never sent are still being received. New Zealand has been reading them for a century. The reader the letters were written for, the country, the childhood, the brother who died in France, was never going to write back. But the letters required no answer. They only required the writing. She wrote them. They were extraordinary. And the country that reads them is still, a century later, the country that could not hold her. That is the correspondence. That is the story of what was sent and what was kept and what was lost and what arrived, after everything, in the only form that makes the distance between where she was and where she was writing about disappear completely, in the form of the story itself, which is always arriving, which is always the letter that finds its reader regardless of what the post can carry.
The Wellington that Katherine Mansfield was born into was a city in the late Victorian period of its development, a city that had been a British colonial settlement for less than 50 years, and that was in the active process of deciding what it was and what it valued and who it was for. The social hierarchy was still forming. The cultural institutions were still being built. The question of what a New Zealand identity looked like, distinct from the British identity that the colonial project had imported and that the majority settler culture was trying to reproduce at the far end of the world, was a question that New Zealand in 1888 had not yet answered.
Into this context, the Beauchamp family occupied a specific and relatively comfortable position. Harold Beauchamp was a man of business in the most direct colonial sense, a man who had built a successful career through the practical work of commerce, who understood money and its management with the specific intelligence that commercial success requires, and who valued the stability and the reputation that money and respectability together provided. He was not a man of letters. He was not a man who read widely or thought deeply about aesthetic questions, or understood with any particular clarity what the daughter who was writing poems and stories at age 9 was doing or why it mattered. But he was not unkind. He sent his daughters to London for their education. He provided the allowance that funded the life in Europe that killed Katherine and produced her best work. He was, in his way, the person whose resources made the career possible, even as his world was the world she needed to escape. Annie Beauchamp, the mother, was a more opaque figure in the correspondence and the journals, present in the domestic world of the Wellington childhood with a quality of gentle unavailability that the daughters experienced differently and that Katherine experienced as a particular kind of loneliness. The mother who is not quite reachable is a figure who appears in the stories, not always directly, not always as a portrait of Annie Beauchamp specifically, but as the quality of emotional distance within proximity that the Burnell family stories return to again and again. The grandmother, Mrs. Dyer, was something different. She appears in the stories as Mrs. Fairfield, a woman of warmth and practicality and the specific kind of wisdom that the colonial generation of women who had built their lives from practical work rather than inherited comfort possessed. She is the warmest presence in the Wellington stories, the figure whose love is most directly expressed and most unconditionally available. Katherine Mansfield's relationship with her grandmother was, by the account of the letters and journals, the closest and most uncomplicated family relationship of her childhood, the relationship that carried the most simple and the most enduring warmth. She lost her grandmother in 1903, in the year she first went to London. The loss was real, and it shaped the way she wrote about the grandmother figure in the stories, with the specific tenderness that comes from writing about someone who is not available to receive the tenderness, who can only be reached through the fiction. The letters she sent home from London during the first period of her education there, she was between 14 and 17, at Queen's College, surrounded for the first time by people for whom the questions she was asking about literature and art and the world were ordinary rather than eccentric, are the letters of a person discovering that the world is larger than she had been able to see from Wellington. Not a discovery that diminished Wellington, exactly. A discovery that placed Wellington in a context that made its smallness visible for the first time. The colony was small. The colony was provincial. The colony was not where the things she cared about were happening. These were not comfortable discoveries. They were necessary ones. She returned to Wellington in 1906 and spent 2 years there. The 2 years are documented in the letters she sent to the friends she had made in London, and in the journal entries from the period, and they are the record of a person in the wrong place. Not miserable in the simple sense, but out of alignment with the environment in a way that the best journal entries describe with a precision that makes the reader understand immediately what it feels like to be genuinely in the wrong world. She wrote, she played her cello, she formed a romantic attachment to a young woman, Maata Mahupuku, a Maori woman of considerable beauty and character who was navigating her own relationship with the colonial social world, that the letters describe with the specific intensity of young love that knows itself to be transgressive and cannot quite decide whether the transgression is the most exciting part or the most frightening part. She observed Wellington with the trained attention of a writer who is storing material. She negotiated with her father. She left. The 1908 departure is the pivot around which the entire life turns. Everything before it is preparation. Everything after it is the consequence. She was going back to London to become a writer. She was going back because the alternative, remaining in Wellington, marrying appropriately, producing children, participating in the social life of a colonial city that had no particular use for the thing she most needed to be, was not an alternative she was prepared to accept. The life she went back to build was more complicated and more painful and more productive than the 19-year-old who left Wellington in July 1908 could have imagined. It was the life of a woman who loved both men and women, in a time and a context that did not have adequate language for that, who contracted a serious illness from a relationship that ended badly and that left consequences she would spend years managing, who married a man she left the next morning, and who spent the rest of her adult life in a relationship with John Middleton Murray that was central and sustaining and also demanding in ways that the letters document in their most honest passages. It was also the life of a writer who was producing in the years between 1908 and 1923 a body of work that would reshape the English short story and that would be recognized in the decades after her death as one of the most significant contributions to modernist fiction that the period produced. The recognition came slowly, and it came posthumously, and it came filtered through the editorial decisions of John Middleton Murray, who controlled the publication of her unpublished work and her private papers after her death, and who made decisions about what to publish and how to present it that served his understanding of his wife and their relationship more than they necessarily served the historical record. But the work itself, the stories that she published in her lifetime and that have been continuously in print since her death, the work requires no mediation. The stories speak for themselves, with the clarity and the force that the best writing always achieves, the clarity of language that has been refined to the point where it cannot be simplified without losing something essential, and the force of emotion that has been transmuted through craft into something that can be received by a reader who has not shared the specific experience the story describes. The Wellington stories are the most celebrated.
But the European stories, the stories set in German pension houses and French hotels, and the specific social world of the traveling English person in continental Europe are also remarkable, and they are remarkable in a different way. They are the stories of the outsider, observing a world that is not quite her own, observing it with the combination of fascination and detachment that the outsider position permits, and producing from that observation something that is both a precise account of a specific social world and a meditation on what it feels like to be perpetually between worlds. She was always between worlds, between New Zealand and England, between the colonial identity and the metropolitan literary identity, between the woman who loved women and the woman who was married to a man, between the dying body and the writing mind, between the obligation to the dead brother and the running out of time to honor it. The letters she wrote across these divides are the evidence of a person living at the intersection of contradictions that her century could not resolve, and that her short life did not allow her to resolve for herself. They are extraordinarily honest documents, honest in the way that letters written to people you trust are honest, without the careful self-presentation that published work requires, admitting the fear and the financial anxiety and the physical pain, and the specific daily difficulty of being the person she was in the circumstances she was in. She wrote thousands of them, to Murray, to Ida Baker, to her family, to the literary friends and acquaintances who were the community in which her professional life was conducted. She wrote them from wherever she was, from the various rooms and houses of England and France and Switzerland and the Italian Riviera, and in the aggregate, they constitute a biography of a life as it was actually lived that no external account could fully replicate. And alongside the letters she sent, there were the letters she did not send, the stories, which were the correspondence she maintained with the places and the people and the quality of light and feeling that she was no longer able to reach through the ordinary channels of communication. She could write a letter to her father about money, and to Murray about her health, and to Ida Baker about the specific difficulties of the day. She could not write a letter to the Bay at Days Bay, to the grandmother who had died 20 years before, to the Wellington childhood that existed now only in the memory and in the fiction that the memory made possible. The stories are the letters she wrote to those unreachable destinations. They are the correspondence that the conventional post could not carry. New Zealand has been receiving those letters for a century. It puts her face on the currency and names prizes after her and preserves the house where she was born as a museum.
It has been the recipient of the most sustained and the most eloquent correspondence any New Zealander has ever produced. And the return correspondence, the letters New Zealand has written back, is the currency and the prizes and the museum and the 50 years of posthumous celebration. It is not an equal exchange. But then, the most important letters rarely produce equal exchanges. They produce responses that are proportionate to what the recipient is capable of, which is not always proportionate to what the correspondence deserved. She deserved more than a note on the $50 note. She deserved the country that could have held her long enough to let her work in conditions adequate to what she was trying to do. She deserved the years that the tuberculosis took from her. She deserved the recognition that arrived only after she was dead and that went to the name rather than the person. She received the posthumous recognition. The name is everywhere. The person was 34 years old in a room in Fontainebleau when the hemorrhage came. The letters are still being received. They will be received as long as the stories are read, which is as long as anyone is reading prose in English. The destination that the letters never reached, the living New Zealand, the living Wellington of her childhood, the living grandmother and the living brother, those destinations are gone. But the letters found their readers anyway. They always do. That is what the best letters accomplish. They arrive regardless of what the post can carry.
The literary world that Katherine Mansfield entered when she returned to London in 1908 was a world in transition, a world where the Victorian certainties about what literature was and what it was for were being challenged by a generation of writers who understood that the psychological and social landscape of the 20th century required new forms, new approaches to narrative and to the representation of consciousness, new ways of using language to describe the interior experience of being alive in a world that was changing faster than the existing literary conventions could accommodate. She arrived in this world as an outsider, in multiple senses. She was colonial in a literary culture that valued metropolitan credentials. She was a woman in a world where the most significant literary reputations were still predominantly male. She was writing in a short story form that the English literary establishment valued less highly than the novel. And she was bringing to her fiction a sensibility that was formed by an entirely different landscape and social world from the English one. A sensibility shaped by the Pacific light and the colonial social geography, and the specific quality of experience that New Zealand in the 1890s and 1900s had produced in a child who was paying extremely close attention. She found her place in this world, but she found it on the margins rather than at the center, and the marginality was not simply a matter of her origins. She was writing in a mode, the compressed, lyrical, psychologically precise short story, that the literary mainstream was not yet fully prepared to recognize as the equal of the novel, and she was writing it with a quality of female interiority that the male-dominated literary establishment of the period found difficult to place in its existing categories of value. She found champions. Ford Madox Ford published her early work. The editors of the little magazines that were the publishing platform for the modernist experiment gave her space. And Virginia Woolf, the other great woman writer of the modernist period, the one whose reputation has overshadowed Mansfield's in the century since both of their deaths, found in her work something that she described as simultaneously the most exciting and the most threatening writing she had encountered from a contemporary.
The relationship between Katherine Mansfield and Virginia Woolf is one of the most complex and most studied literary relationships of the 20th century. They met in 1917, at a point when both were already established enough to recognize each other as serious, and their connection was immediate and charged in the specific way that the connection between writers who are doing similar things in different registers is charged. They read each other's work with the intensity of practitioners examining the technique of another practitioner at the frontier of the same discipline. They influenced each other in ways that neither fully acknowledged. They were envious of each other, with the specific quality of envy that people feel when they encounter in another person the qualities they most wish they possessed. Woolf wrote in her diary that Mansfield was the only writer whose work made her envious, the only contemporary who was doing something in fiction that she felt she could not quite do herself. The specific quality of Mansfield's rendering of experience, the way she could make the physical world present in the prose with a directness and a sensory immediacy that Woolf's more meditative approach could not achieve,
was what Woolf was responding to. And Mansfield wrote about Woolf with a combination of admiration and frustration that suggests she understood exactly what the dynamic between them was. They were rivals. They were the two most important women writers of their generation, working in the same modernist tradition, with overlapping literary circles, publishing through some of the same outlets. The Hogarth Press, which Leonard and Virginia Woolf had established as a small literary press, published Mansfield's Prelude in 1918. The publication was significant, and the relationship between the two women during the period of its preparation was the most sustained and the most genuinely intimate of the connection between them. And then it became more complicated. The tuberculosis was advancing. Mansfield was spending more time in the south of France and in Switzerland, away from London, away from the literary circle that Woolf occupied at the center of. The letters between them became less frequent. The intimacy became more distant.
And Woolf, in the journals that she kept and that were published after her own death, recorded her responses to Mansfield's illness and eventually to her death, with a mixture of genuine grief and the specific relief that the death of a rival sometimes produces in the person who survives, a relief that Woolf was honest enough to record, and that the scholars who have studied the relationship have been appropriately uncomfortable with. The two women are often studied together as the defining female modernists of their generation. The comparison is illuminating and also somewhat reductive, because the differences between them are as significant as the similarities. Woolf was English, metropolitan, from the heart of the Bloomsbury literary culture. Mansfield was colonial, peripatetic, always slightly outside the circles she inhabited. Woolf lived until 1941. Mansfield died at 34. The difference in the size of the bodies of work they produced is a direct consequence of that difference in lifespan, and the comparison between them sometimes does not account adequately for what Mansfield might have produced in the decades she did not have. What she produced in the year she had is remarkable enough. The stories are the evidence. They are the letters she was writing to all of the places and people she could not reach. To Wellington, to the grandmother, to the brother, to the England she inhabited and never quite belonged to the version of herself that a different life might have allowed her to become. They are the correspondence of a writer who understood that the most important thing she needed to say could not be said directly, that they required the specific indirection of fiction to arrive at the truth that the truth, stated plainly, cannot always provide. She was a genius of the specific quality of light at a particular time of day, the specific quality of sound in a room where adults are having a conversation that the child in the corner is too young to understand, but old enough to feel, the specific quality of the moment before something changes, the quality of the afternoon in the garden party before the court arrives with the news of the dead man.
She could render these specific qualities with a precision that makes the reader understand, at the level of the body rather than just the mind, what it was like to be in that specific place at that specific moment, with that specific quality of experience pressing against the consciousness. This is what the stories are. This is what makes them still available to a reader a century after they were written. The specific quality of the rendering, which is so precise that it bypasses the strangeness of the historical distance and the cultural distance and arrives directly at whatever it is in the reader that recognizes the truth of what is being described. She wrote these stories while the tuberculosis was advancing. She wrote them while the financial anxiety was a constant presence in the correspondence. She wrote them while the relationship with Murray was demanding and sustaining and complicated in equal measure. She wrote them in the rented rooms and the borrowed houses and the sanatoriums and the convalescent hotels that the illness and the search for health made her home across the years of the exile. The exile was total. She left Wellington at 19. She never went back. The letters she sent home were letters sent by a person who was not going back, who knew at some level, from fairly early in the 15 years of her adult life, that the return was not possible, and that the stories were the closest she would ever come to it. This is the particular quality of the letters she never sent. They are written by someone who understands that the place they are writing to is not reachable by any ordinary means, that the Wellington of Prelude and At the Bay and the Garden Party is not the Wellington that exists in 1920 or 1921 or 1922, but the Wellington that existed in her childhood, which is a place that can only be reached through fiction. She was not writing about New Zealand. She was writing about the specific New Zealand that she had left and that had continued to exist in her memory with the uncanny precision of significant childhood experience, stored against use that the adult consciousness finds for it.
The stories found their use for it. They remain the most precise rendering of that specific world that literature in English has produced. They are better than memory. They are more true than accuracy.
They are the letters that the place deserved to receive, and that the writer, through the specific urgency of the obligation to Leslie and to the childhood and to the truth of what the place had been, provided. She died at 34, having honored the obligation only partially. There were more stories she planned to write, more of the Wellington world she intended to render, more of the correspondence she was in the middle of sending. The tuberculosis did not allow her to complete it. The final months at the Gurdjieff Institute at Fontainebleau were months in which she was looking for the health that would allow the writing to continue, looking with the specific urgency of someone who understood that the time was running out and that the correspondence was not yet finished. Gurdjieff's Institute was a place that the English literary establishment found eccentric, and that Mansfield's friends and her husband found alarming, in the way that the decisions of seriously ill people sometimes alarm the people who love them. She chose it because the conventional medicine had not worked, and because she needed to believe that something could work, and because the community at the Institute offered something she had not had enough of in the peripatetic life of the exile, a sense of belonging to a place and a group, of having a daily life that was structured and purposeful, and not defined entirely by the illness. She was happy there by the accounts of people who saw her in the months before her death. She wrote in her letters that she was finding something she had been looking for. Whether she was finding it or persuading herself she was finding it is a question that the letters cannot definitively answer, because the letters she was writing in the final months were letters written by someone who was doing the best she could with the time remaining, which is always a kind of performance, as well as a kind of truth. She died on the 9th of January, 1923. She had been laughing. The hemorrhage came. Ida Baker, who had been her devoted companion throughout the European years, and who had been present through the various illnesses and treatments and recoveries and relapses, was with her. Murray, who had come to visit, was nearby. She had been writing to New Zealand for 15 years. She had been sending the letters that the post could carry, and keeping the letters that only the fiction could carry. She had been maintaining a correspondence with a place she could not reach and a world she could not return to, in the only medium that allowed the impossible correspondence to take place. The letters arrived. They are arriving still. They will continue to arrive for as long as there are readers who need the specific truth that Katherine Mansfield's fiction provides. The truth about what it is like to be in a particular place at a particular time, with the full weight of consciousness pressing against the moment, aware that the moment is passing and trying to hold it in the only form that holding is possible. The letters she never sent are the most important correspondence she produced. They are addressed to places that do not exist anymore, and to people who have been dead for a century. They arrive regardless. Ida Baker occupies a strange and important position in the story of Katherine Mansfield, a position that the literary biographies have found difficult to account for adequately, because the relationship between the two women does not fit neatly into any of the categories that biography conventionally uses. She was not a romantic partner in any sustained or publicly acknowledged sense, though the quality of the connection was clearly more than simply friendship. She was not a literary collaborator in the professional sense, though her presence in Mansfield's life was one of the conditions that made the writing possible. She was, for most of the 15 years between Mansfield's return to London in 1908 and her death in 1923, simply the most reliably present person, the person who came when she was needed, and who was needed more often than Murray or anyone else in the literary circle could provide. Ida Baker came from a Scottish family with colonial roots, which gave her and Mansfield a shared background of the colonial experience that the English literary world they both inhabited did not share. They had met at Queen's College in the first period of Mansfield's London education, in 1903 and 1904, when they were both young women from the edges of the British Empire finding their feet in the metropolitan centre. The connection between them was immediate, and its quality was unmistakable to anyone observing them, a quality of mutual recognition, of two people who understood each other in ways that the social world around them did not quite understand either of them. The relationship through the years of the exile was the relationship of two people connected by a bond that neither of them consistently named or consistently acted on, but that neither of them was able to relinquish. Mansfield called Ida LM, initials for Leslie Moore, a name Mansfield had given her, and the nickname is itself a kind of correspondence,
a private language between them that excluded the rest of the world and acknowledged the specific quality of the connection. She wrote to LM with the specific honesty of someone writing to a person they trust completely, and she wrote about LM in the journals with the specific ambivalence of someone who depends on a person more than they are entirely comfortable acknowledging. The ambivalence is real, and it is recorded honestly in the correspondence. Mansfield was not always kind to Ida Baker. She was sometimes irritable and dismissive and demanding in ways that the letters record without apology. She was aware, in her more honest moments, of the degree to which the relationship was asymmetrical, of the degree to which Ida Baker gave more than she received, in material and emotional terms, and did so without complaint and apparently without resentment. The awareness produced guilt, and the guilt produced irritability, and the irritability is in the letters. But beneath the irritability was the fundamental fact. Ida Baker was the person who came. She came to the south of France when Mansfield was ill and needed someone to manage the practical requirements of life in a condition that made practical management difficult. She came to Switzerland when the illness had progressed to the point where care was required. She came to the Gurdjieff Institute, and she was present on the night of January 9th, 1923. She came across 15 years whenever the situation required it, which was often. This quality of unfailing presence is not a small thing. It is, in the context of Mansfield's life, the peripatetic life, the constant movement between countries and rooms, and the specific difficulties of a progressive illness managed at a distance from the conventional support structures of family and home, one of the most significant facts about how the writing was possible at all. The conditions in which the stories were written were conditions in which Ida Baker's presence was one of the factors that kept the practical life from consuming all of the energy that the writing required.
The literary biographies have not always known how to honor this. The tendency is to place Ida Baker in the category of devoted friend, and to move on to the literary relationships and the literary controversies, which are more easily accommodated by the conventions of literary biography. But the relationship with Ida Baker is as much a part of the story of how Katherine Mansfield's work was made as the relationship with Virginia Woolf, or the relationship with Murray, or the tuberculosis itself. She wrote letters to Ida Baker that are among the most revealing she produced. Letters that show the private person behind the public writer with a nakedness that the more carefully managed correspondence with Murray does not always achieve. They are the letters of someone who is not performing, who is not constructing an image, who is writing to the person most likely to understand what is actually being said. The letters to Murray are different. They are more literary, more consciously crafted, more aware of themselves as letters that might eventually be read by people other than the person they were addressed to. Murray was himself a literary figure, a critic and editor of considerable standing, and the correspondence between two literary people always has a quality of performance that the correspondence between a literary person and a devoted non-literary friend does not always have. Murray published the letters after Mansfield's death. He published the journals. He published several volumes of her unpublished work. He shaped the public understanding of who she was and what she had written in ways that extended the control he had over her work well beyond her death, and that the scholars who have studied the relationship in subsequent decades have found both significant and problematic. The problem is not simply that he published private material. The letters and journals contain extraordinary writing, and the world is richer for having access to them. The problem is in the framing, in the portrait of Mansfield that the editions construct, in the way the presentation of the material serves a particular narrative about the relationship between Murray and Mansfield that positions him in the most flattering available light, and that does not always reflect the complexity and the difficulty of the actual relationship as the letters themselves reveal it.
He was, by the evidence of the correspondence, a man of genuine literary intelligence and genuine emotional limitation. A person who was able to engage with Mansfield's work with real understanding and real appreciation, but he was not always able to engage with Mansfield herself with the consistency and the emotional generosity that the relationship and the illness required. He was not there as much as she needed. He was not in France as much as he was in London. He was not at the Gurdjieff Institute in the final months. He was nearby at the end, but the regular presence was Ida Baker's. The posthumous management of her legacy was in some ways the most consistent thing Murray gave to the relationship, the thing he did most reliably and with the most sustained commitment. He kept her name alive in the years when it might have faded.
He advocated for her work in literary circles where his opinion carried weight. He produced the editions that made the private writing available. Whatever the problems of the framing, the act of keeping the work available was a genuine contribution. But the work did not need him in the end. The stories survived on their own terms, because the best work always does. The Prelude and At the Bay and The Garden Party and the smaller stories and the correspondence, all of it is in print, continuously, a century after her death. The readers who encounter the work encounter it directly, without needing Murray's framing to access it, and what they find is the thing itself. The extraordinary precision of the rendering, the specific quality of the worlds she described, the letters she was writing to the places and the people and the quality of experience that she could only reach through the fiction. The letters she never sent have been arriving for a century. They will continue to arrive. The reader who opens Prelude for the first time and finds themselves in a New Zealand garden with a quality of attention they did not expect from a story written in 1918 in England is receiving a letter from Katherine Mansfield that was posted in Karori in 1895 and that has been in transit ever since, finding its way to each new reader through the medium of the fiction that makes the impossible journey possible. This is what the stories accomplish. This is what the form allows.
The letter that cannot be sent by the ordinary post, the letter to a time that cannot be revisited, to a brother who is dead, to a grandmother who died before the writer was old enough to say what needed to be said, finds its way through the specific alchemy of fiction to the reader who is waiting for it without knowing they are waiting. She was sending these letters for 15 years, from the rented rooms and the borrowed houses and the sanatoriums and the hotels of exile. She was sending them to New Zealand, to the Wellington of her childhood, to the specific quality of afternoon that she could describe with precision from the distance of France, but that she could not experience again except in the writing. The writing is the experience. For Katherine Mansfield, the fiction was the closest available substitute for return. The stories are the letters she wrote to the home she could not go back to, addressed to the country that had produced her and that she had fled, and that she needed in order to be who she was. New Zealand has been receiving these letters for 100 years. It has placed her face on the currency and named prizes after her, and built the museum in the house where she was born. It has claimed the writer it could not contain. It has traded on the legacy of the woman it suffocated. The exchange is not equal, but then the exchange between a country and the writer it produces rarely is. The country produces the conditions. The writer flees the conditions and uses them as material. The country claims the work. The writer is dead before the claiming begins. She is dead. The letters are still arriving. Wellington is still receiving the correspondence that Katherine Mansfield was sending from France and Switzerland and the Italian Riviera and the Gurdjieff Institute across 15 years of exile, in the form of the stories that are the truest account anyone has ever given of what it was to be alive in that specific place at that specific time, with that specific quality of consciousness pressing against the world. She is 34 years old. She is in a room in Fontainebleau. She has been laughing. The letters are in the post. They are always in the post. They are arriving now, in the hands of the reader who is reading this, and who will, if they have not yet, go to the stories and find themselves in Wellington in a way they did not expect and did not quite prepare for. That is the correspondence. That is the account of what was sent and what was kept and what was lost and what arrived. And the arriving is still happening, a century after the writer who was doing the sending put down the pen for the last time. She sent the letters. They are still coming. They will keep coming for as long as there are people who need to receive them. The tuberculosis that killed Katherine Mansfield in January 1923 had been present in her body since at least 1917, when she coughed blood in the night for the first time and understood what it meant. The disease was, in the second decade of the 20th century, the disease of the literary and artistic world in a way that it is difficult to fully appreciate from the perspective of a century later. It was the disease that killed Keats and Chekhov and a generation of artists and writers for whom the combination of poverty and overwork and the confined urban spaces of the period were the conditions that made the bacillus available and the immune system insufficiently equipped to resist it. She had been working in the conditions that produced the disease.
She had been living in cold rooms and inadequate lodgings, and the specific physical conditions of the exile life, the life of a writer without a steady income, depending on the allowance from Harold Beauchamp and the sporadic payments from literary publications, unable to afford the warmth and the nutrition and the rest that the body requires for the sustained work of resisting a pathogen that is patient and relentless and does not care about the quality of the prose being written in the room. The diagnosis confirmed what she had feared. The years after the diagnosis were years of management and treatment and the continuous search for the climate and the conditions that would slow the progression. The winters in the south of France, the summers in Switzerland, the Italian Riviera, the various sanatoriums that offered the cure that the disease did not ultimately permit. She wrote through all of it. The stories she produced in the years between the diagnosis and her death are the work of a writer who understood that the time was limited and who was using the time with the specific urgency of someone who has a correspondence to complete and who can feel the time running out. The urgency is in the prose.
The compressed intensity of the late stories, the quality of attention that leaves nothing unnoticed, that gives equal weight to the significant and the apparently trivial, because the apparently trivial is never actually trivial to the consciousness that is paying attention, is the urgency of a writer who knows that the correspondence will not be infinite, that there are letters she will not finish, that the obligation to Leslie and to the childhood world requires her to work faster than the body is willing to support. She worked faster than the body could support. The later years were years in which the writing and the illness were in direct competition for the resources of a body that was being asked to sustain both. She went to the south of France, she went to Switzerland, she went to the Gurdjieff Institute. She kept writing. She kept sending the letters she could send and the letters she could not send. She kept doing the work. The work she left unfinished is one of the most haunting aspects of her legacy. She had plans for more stories in the Wellington sequence, more of the Burnell family world, more of the specific light and the specific air and the specific quality of consciousness that the Wellington stories render. The stories she planned and did not write are, in the most literal sense, letters she never sent. They are the correspondence that the tuberculosis prevented. What would they have said? There is no way to know, and the speculation is both irresistible and ultimately fruitless. What is knowable is the quality of what she had produced to that point, and what the quality suggests about the direction the correspondence was taking. The Wellington stories were moving toward something, toward a fuller and more complete rendering of the childhood world, toward a greater intimacy with the specific quality of experience that the distance was making possible to see. The stories she planned would have added to and deepened what she had already produced. They do not exist. The tuberculosis stopped the correspondence before it was complete. And the incompleteness is part of the story, part of what New Zealand claims when it claims Katherine Mansfield, though the claiming does not always acknowledge what the incompleteness contains. The incompleteness contains the reminder that what she was able to produce was produced under conditions of sustained physical deprivation and chronic illness, and the specific anxiety of a writer who does not know from one month to the next whether the body will hold long enough to complete the work that the mind needs to do. It contains the reminder that the genius that New Zealand now celebrates on its currency was not protected in its lifetime from the conditions that killed it at 34. The protection would not have been simple. The tuberculosis was not preventable in any straightforward way with the medical knowledge of the period. But the conditions of the exile, the cold rooms, the inadequate lodgings, the financial anxiety that made adequate rest and nutrition difficult to maintain, were conditions that a more generous institutional response to what she was producing might have been able to address. She was producing, in those conditions, some of the most significant fiction in English. The conditions were not adequate to the production. They were never adequate. And New Zealand, which now places her face on the currency, has not fully reckoned with the degree to which its failure to provide adequate conditions for her as a living writer is connected to the death at 34 that made the currency and the museum and the prizes possible. The dead writer is easier to claim than the living one. The dead writer does not require housing or health care or the financial support that would have allowed her to write in conditions adequate to what she was doing. The dead writer can be placed on the currency and honored with prizes and commemorated in a museum without the inconvenience of having to actually support the conditions in which the work is made. This is not unique to Katherine Mansfield and not unique to New Zealand.
it is the general condition of the relationship between societies and the artists they eventually claim as national treasures. The relationship in which the honor arrives after the difficulties are over, and the artist is no longer available to receive it in the form that would have mattered most. What would have mattered most to Katherine Mansfield was not the currency or the museum or the prizes. What would have mattered was the time, the years the tuberculosis took from her, the years in which the Wellington correspondence would have been extended and deepened and completed.
The stories she would have written in a long life are the honoring she deserved and did not receive. She received the posthumous version. It is real and it is valuable, and it does not approach the adequacy of what was owed. She is on the $50 note. The stories are in print. The museum is in the house where she was born. And the letters she was writing when the hemorrhage came, the letters to Wellington, to the grandmother, to the brother, to the specific quality of light on the bay in the morning, those letters are in a state of permanent transmission, finding their way to the readers who are waiting for them, arriving regardless of what the post can carry or what the body can sustain, or what the country was able to provide. She sent them. They are still coming. And the correspondence is, in the only sense that matters, complete. Because the reader who receives the stories receives everything that was in them, everything that Katherine Mansfield put into the writing in the 15 years between the departure from Wellington and the hemorrhage at Fontainebleau, everything the country produced and lost and found again in the form of the fiction that makes the impossible journey from exile back to home. The letters she never sent are the most important ones she wrote. They are always arriving. They are arriving now. There is a particular irony in the face of Katherine Mansfield on the New Zealand $50 note that the country has not fully sat with. The currency of a nation is the most compressed possible statement of what the nation values. The decision to put a particular face on the money is a decision about identity, about who the nation is and who it wants to be seen to be. The choice of Katherine Mansfield for the $50 note is, on one reading, an act of generous acknowledgement. The country recognizing in the face of its greatest writer the person whose contribution to the world deserves this specific form of national celebration. On another reading, it is the ultimate expression of the irony at the heart of the story. She was a person who fled New Zealand because she could not breathe there. She was a person who called it a provincial suburb and left it at 19 and never came back. She was a person whose genius New Zealand was not able to support in the conditions required to sustain it. And the country she fled and never returned to puts her face on the currency as an expression of national pride.
The pride is real. The irony is also real, and the country has not resolved the tension between them, has not sat honestly with the full account of what it produced and what it failed to provide, and what it received. The stories, the currency, the museum, the prizes, the 100 years of posthumous celebration, in return for the woman and the work. The full account would require acknowledging that the face on the currency is the face of a person who understood that New Zealand could not hold her, who acted on that understanding at 19, and who spent the rest of her short life producing the work that the holding down would have prevented. The genius required the escape. The stories required the distance. The correspondence was only possible from exile. This is not a comfortable conclusion for a national narrative. It suggests that the country's contribution to what Katherine Mansfield produced was not the supporting conditions, but the limiting conditions. Not the encouragement, but the constraint. Not the generous environment, but the insufficient one. It suggests that the glory that New Zealand claims in Katherine Mansfield is glory that it produced by being the place she had to leave in order to become what she became. Is this true? It is at least a serious question. A question that the currency and the museum and the prizes answer without asking, by presenting the claiming as uncomplicated, as if the face on the note is the natural and appropriate recognition of a natural and straightforward relationship between a nation and the writer it produced. The relationship was not natural, and it was not straightforward, and it was not without cost. She paid the cost. She paid it in the 15 years of exile and the cold rooms and the financial anxiety and the tuberculosis that the conditions of the exile contributed to. She paid it in the distance from the place she was writing about, which was the condition of the clarity with which she wrote about it. She paid it in the death at 34. New Zealand received the work.
It has been trading on the work for a century. The face on the $50 note is the most literal expression of the trait, the conversion of the writer's genius into the national currency, the acknowledgement that what she produced has monetary as well as cultural value, the placing of her face on the medium of exchange. She would have understood the irony. She understood most ironies.
She recorded them in the journals and the letters and the fiction with the specific quality of attention that made all of her recording worth keeping. She is on the note. She is in the museum. She is in the stories. She is in the garden at Karori in the prose of the prelude, in the bay at Days Bay in the prose of At the Bay, in the garden party in the prose of The Garden Party. She is in the specific quality of light on a Wellington afternoon that she described from France with a precision that would have been impossible if she had remained in Wellington to describe it. She is everywhere in the national cultural life of the country she fled, and everywhere in the prose of the stories that made the fleeing necessary. She is the most important correspondence that New Zealand has ever received, and the most important thing that New Zealand has ever failed to hold long enough to receive properly. She is 34 years old in a room in Fontainebleau. She has been laughing. The letters are in the post. They will keep arriving. New Zealand has been reading them for a century. It will keep reading them for as long as there are readers who need what the letters contain, which is the truth about what it is to be from a specific place and to have left it, and to be unable to go back, and to be writing to it from the other side of the distance that the leaving created. That is the correspondence. Those are the letters she never sent. They are still arriving. They are arriving now, in the hands of every reader who opens the stories for the first time and finds themselves in Wellington without having been warned. She sent them. They are still coming, and they will still be coming when the face on the $50 note has been replaced and the museum has been rebuilt, and everything that the country has built around the memory of the woman it could not hold has been renovated for the century after this one. The letters outlast everything. That is what the best letters do. They arrive regardless of what the post can carry. They arrive at the reader who needs them, in the form the reader needs, in the time that the reader needs them. Katherine Mansfield has been sending these letters for 100 years. She will keep sending them for as long as the stories are read. That is the correspondence. That is the full accounting of what was sent and what was kept and what was lost and what arrived. And the arriving is still happening, now, in the hands of the reader. She sent the letters. She always did. She was always sending. The archive that holds Katherine Mansfield's correspondence is distributed across several collections, in the Alexander Turnbull Library in Wellington, in the British Library, in the collections of various universities that have acquired portions of the letters and journals over the decades since her death. The archive is extensive. It is, in its aggregate, one of the richest deposits of personal and literary material that a New Zealand-born writer has produced. The scholars who work with the archive describe the experience of reading through the letters in sequence, of following the correspondence from the Wellington childhood to the London years, to the illness and the exile, and the final months at the Gurdjieff Institute, as the experience of inhabiting a consciousness that is both specific and universal, that is Katherine Mansfield specifically, and also something more general, the consciousness of someone who is trying, across a lifetime of letters and journals and stories, to make the world of their experience available to others in its full specificity and its full feeling. She succeeded. The archive and the published work together constitute one of the most complete and most revealing records of a literary consciousness that modern English literature contains. They show the writer working, the process of observation and selection and rendering that produces the fiction, the specific daily reality of what the writing requires from the person who is doing it. They show the person behind the writer, the financial anxiety and the physical pain, and the longing for the places and the people she could not reach, and the sustained determination to complete the correspondence despite everything the circumstances arrayed against its completion. They show finally what New Zealand produced and what it lost, and what it received in return. The woman it produced at 19 was a writer of extraordinary gifts who understood that her gifts required conditions the colony could not provide. The woman it lost was 34 years old and had completed only a portion of the correspondence she was in the middle of sending. The work it received, the stories and the letters and the journals that the 15 years of exile produced, is the most significant body of writing that any New Zealander has contributed to the literature of the English language. The face on the $50 note is the face of that writer. The face in the archive is the face of that person. They are the same face, and they are not the same face. And the difference between them is the difference between the claiming and the full accounting. The full accounting is what this story has been attempting. It is, like all full accountings of complex things, incomplete. There is more in the archive than can be said here. There is more in the stories than any account of them can convey. There is more in the life than the life was given time to express. She died at 34. She was always sending. The letters are still arriving. That is the correspondence. That is the full story, in the form that the full story is available in. The rest is in the archive, and in the stories, and in the specific quality of a Wellington afternoon that Katherine Mansfield described from France a century ago, and that the reader who encounters that description for the first time finds themselves inside, suddenly and completely, as if the distance between then and now and here and there had dissolved for the duration of the reading. It dissolves. That is what the letters accomplish. That is what she was sending them to accomplish. She sent them. They arrived. They are still arriving now.